Okay, this week I have the tremendous pleasure of introducing you to somebody that I've actually kind of followed for a while, very lurker-ish, but my friend Mike Metlay kind of keyed me into the fact that, hey, he'd be up for a chat, and so I reached out to Herman Pearl. Now, I'm not sure that many of you know who Herman Pearl might be, but if I say that Herman Pearl is also known by the name Soy Sos, many of you probably do know who I'm talking about. I followed his discussions for a while on Muff Wiggler, but also I follow him on Facebook, and I've gotten an opportunity to see him talk about a really full life. In a recent Facebook posting, he listed himself as a sound designer / artist / engineer, producer / DJ / musician, and he works with his wife Stacy, who's a choreographer and visual artist. So from what I can tell, we have all media arts covered. And with that, I'll welcome Herman to the podcast. Hi, Herman. How are you?
Hey, Darwin. How you doing?
I'm all right. Thanks for being willing to chat with us.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of the podcast. I love it.
Fantastic. Well, that's good news. So why don't we kick this off by having you tell people what it means when we kind of have this really broad set of things that you do. Why don't you kind of fill us in on what that looks like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, sure. Well, so I operate a recording studio that's called Tuff Sound. It's spelled like the Marley TUFF sound recording. Right. And so I do that on kind of a daily basis, and I work with a lot of hip-hop artists mainly, and then fill in with all variety of, other sound duties that people need. I do sound design with my wife's dance company, which is called Stacy Pearl Dance Project. I freelance DJ, and then just, kind of a gun for hire for whatever else people need.
Sure. And you also, well, it's funny because you say you DJ, but when I see pictures of your DJ rig, it looks like you're kind of have an Ableton-like setup. Do you do sort of that creative Ableton-based DJ stuff, or do you just do spinning of records in more typical fashion?
Yeah, well, I started DJing initially with vinyl, and I don't do vinyl much anymore unless people are asking me to do like an all jazz set or something like that, something more like, or maybe like roots reggae. Mm-hmm. But then when I switched to Serato years ago, and I was doing that, and then I recently got into Tractor. So I think I'm switching to Tractor. And I also have a set that I developed in Ableton, but that requires so much prep per file that I think I'm going to kind of transition that thing to Tractor because it's sort of a lot easier to do what it is that I want to do. And I think the Ableton thing is almost overkill. Right.
Interesting. Now, doing sound design for dance company, as my listeners will know, I fiddle around with the local dance company a fair bit, but because you're working with your partner on this, obviously you're probably much more engaged in it than I am. What is sound design for a dance company? What is that?
Well, it varies. A lot of times, when I first moved to the house that we're in now years ago, I got connected in with the dance community here before I met my wife, and so I did kind of whatever manner of things people needed. Sometimes people would require, custom things to be recorded, and sometimes they would need songs edited to accommodate, the arrangements that they needed. But with Stacy, we do anything from, she may develop a new work using non-original music, using songs from other artists. And then in some cases, we'll keep those songs, but what we prefer to do is to create original content. And I've kind of been on this thing about using songs too much because I almost usually feel that, especially stuff with lyrics, tends to be so kind of specific and evocative that it can be a distraction from the expression of the dance. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that because certainly in my work, I do both visuals and audio with this dance company. The Third Law Dance Company here in Boulder. And one of the things I'm constantly working on doing is finding ways to not distract from the person on stage, because especially doing visuals, but also with audio, it's really easy to make it so that it's like about me, and I have to keep on remembering that it's not. It's about the dancer, right?
Yeah, and I've also often found with visuals that a lot of times, your average dancer is 5.5 feet tall, and visuals can tend to go all the way up to 20 feet in the air,
right?
And that can make it really hard to focus on the dance, because you've got just this weird height discrepancy.
Oh, sure, right, exactly. Well, then you also have the issue more in rehearsal, I guess, but depending on how improvisational it is, you can also have the problem of the dancers sort of like watching the screen instead of doing their own thing.
Right.
That gets a little troubling as well. My goodness, you do a lot of stuff, and I think you're actually being a little shy about blurting out everything, because when you sent me a little bit of bio information, I mean, you've scored films, you've done touring work. You work as sort of what you call being a kind of a pitch man for Pittsburgh Modular. You have got a lot of irons in the fire. It's really pretty amazing. My question to you is, what was your background like that puts you in a position to be able to have high levels of expertise in all this stuff?
Well, so I think the joke that I put on the site is that my first, I guess, audio tool was a tape recorder at maybe 8 or 10 years old, and sort of quickly became obsessed with that. So I just used to play around with that little cassette recorder all the time, and make my own little audio plays. And in fact, I even snuck it into Star Wars when it came out, and bootlegged the audio of the entire movie. So that was like an early mobile recording experience. I think I'm protected by the statute of limitations on that.
Yeah, so. I think so.
But yeah, I went to I'm from Pittsburgh, and I live in Pittsburgh still. So I went to the Pittsburgh Creative and Performing Arts High School, and that was just like an incredible, mishmash of jazz and funk musicians and young rockers and stuff like that. And we actually had an electronic music class that had an ARP 2600, which I actually ended up with. I ended up being given that by the music department years later. So I did that, and I studied guitar and percussion there. And I think that I just kind of feel like maybe it is that I'm not satisfied doing one thing, and also based on kind of economics, you have to, it's difficult to only do one thing in the arts and have that be your job and be able to survive. You know what I mean?
Sure. There's a certain amount of, I would say, of the things that you do, there's a certain amount where you have to attain a high level of skill. And then there's also a certain amount where you just have to have the onions to say, I'm doing this, right?
Yeah.
And I think that you actually are involved in a lot of those things. I mean, running a recording studio and being involved in working on recording projects, you have to have a certain level of technical skill, and that's kind of things that you can study, or you can work hard at achieving those through trial and error. But at some point, you have to have the balls to say, yeah, I'm good at this, come and pay me to do it. Right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think most audio engineers a lot of audio engineers are people that started recording to document their own stuff,
right?
And then ended up just having friends come over, and gradually just building up a clientele to do it. So and I definitely am one of those type of people. Although when I graduated high school, I ended up out on the road with a band that kind of imploded in California, and I ended up in Portland in the early 80s, and I did find a community college that had a really good recording program. So I did that for 2 years, but I just took the amount of classes that was necessary just to get those classes. I didn't get any kind of a degree.
Right. Got it.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. That's interesting, but it's also it makes me curious a little bit more. So you went on the road. What was your instrument?
So this is kind of funny, but there was a tour that came through Pittsburgh that was sponsored by the Youth International Party called Rock Against Reagan,
Okay.
and it was the Bad Brains were actually the band that was like kind of the touring band that was like rolling with that thing.
Okay.
And there was all kind of problems with that. And I think what happened was the story is that their roadie, whose name was Alvin, talked to some people in our band. It was a band called Stick Against Stone that I had joined when I was in high school. I saw this band and I wanted to be part of it. It was a really cool band. They had like 5 woodwind players, like saxes and clarinet and stuff like that, baritone sax, and 2 drummers. They were a really weird band. But a lot of those people fell off to the side and ended up being a 5-piece band with guitar. I was the first guitarist in that band.
Okay.
And we somehow got thrown into being the touring band for this thing. And it was just a mess. It was like crazy, and I wish someone had documented it, but the band just got out and we did all these dates. We actually played with the Dead Kennedys in Dolores Park in San Francisco, and the Minutemen in LA, and it was really just chaotic. But the people involved in the group, there were some very crazy people in it. And I was just 18 years old, so
Right.
I was like the youngest person on it. We lived on a school bus with 2 dogs and 8 people. It was a nightmare. I mean, it was a real character shaping.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Character
Yeah, I'm
shaping,
glad. I'm
right?
glad for the experience. But
Oh,
yeah.
I'll bet. Yeah.
So we the bus just kind of kept heading north, and we ended up in Portland, and that was great for us. It was great for me and the drummer. I just ended up finding this recording program there, and things were way chilled out from that point.
Right, but at some point you came back to Pittsburgh, and I'm actually kind of curious about this because, in my experience, people who are artists tend to have to leave home in order to achieve any sort of like professional success, right?
Mm-hmm.
That something about being an artist where you grew up is really difficult.
Right.
But you have found yourself back from whence you came, which is really cool. And also it means that, you have a much deeper and rooted connection to the community than somebody who just sort of blows into town. Now, Pittsburgh, I think, is a smaller, is definitely a smaller environment than a lot of the big and what we would consider art cities, right?
Right.
But it sounds to me like you have sort of, gouged out a way for you to have your fingers in a lot of stuff. How important do you think it is to be, and I'll use this phrase, to be home, to do the things that you're doing? And to what extent does that maybe get in the way?
Well, I think the thing about Pittsburgh is definitely on the come up, and it's actually kind of like Portland in the 90s in a way. I mean, that's kind of the joke around here. Because it's the thing about it is it's still affordable to live, and the arts community has really grown. I mean, even just since Stacy moved here in around 2000, like the dance scene has really come up, and she's actually a big part of what's made the dance scene special here. But I think it's one of those things where you kind of suck it up and having missing out on some of the bigger city types of things, and she was definitely going crazy when she first got here from New York.
Right.
Because it is very small time, and there's like 2 degrees of separation with everybody. But it is also good in the way that it's easier to meet the people that you need to meet. So you can form your own crew. You know what I mean?
Sure, I do.
You can find and you can contact people much more easily. It's not so much like in New York. I mean, although I love New York and I love working in New York, but you can find like the people that you need to find pretty easily and figure out relatively quickly whether it's going to be a good fit or not.
Sure. Now, Pittsburgh, I have heard this about Pittsburgh, that it's really on the come. A friend of mine is living there now, and she's kind of been filling me in on, you've got new galleries opening up and new exhibit spaces. Carnegie Mellon's out of there somewhere, right?
Yeah, and
they're blowing up with the kind of things they're doing.
Yeah, and actually, interestingly enough, the building that our dance studio is in, also CMU has the whole fourth floor. They've been there for years, and they're running this sort of theater tech program out of that space.
Sure.
And
Okay.
I'm actually right on the cusp of signing a lease to move my studio to that building as well.
I
So
see.
it's one of those kind of places, like, not every city has that. Like, like Brooklyn way back in the day used to be that kind of thing where you could have a loft space somewhere that would be under the radar. I mean, it's still like that
Right.
around here to a certain
Uh-huh.
extent, but it's changing. You know what I mean? There's a lot of new development, so
Yeah,
you have
well,
to
I
be
think
stealthy.
yeah, I think that it's kind of interesting because yeah, with big or populous cities now, that just can't even happen. Anything that even gets a little bit hip, first of all, gets regulated to the teeth, and secondly, becomes so unaffordable that you have to have a stockbroker in the family in order to afford it.
Yeah, and the thing is, I've said is like we want to have the kind of life where we don't have to pay insane prices for space or drive insane distances to get to where we want to go. So I mean, right now where we live on the East End, our space is 8 blocks away. I can ride my bike there. You know what I mean? And
Sure.
for right now, my studio's in the house. So there's many days that go by where I don't have to drive, and I think that's a really, it's just like we have to choose the kind of life that we want, and I really decided that New York is not the place to do that.
Right. Right.
I used to have a partnership with a DJ producer there, and we did a lot of house records in the early 2000s, late 90s, and I just love going there and working. I love doing stuff. I love the club scene, and I love the diversity. It can tend to be a little bit homogenous around here sometimes if you're not careful.
Right.
But I always found, like, every time I would go there to work, the logistics that we would have to be dealing with in order just to get gear into this place and park the car there, it's insane.
Right. Well, I think I'd like to explore this concept of being sort of an artist in a small city a little more because I actually think that, I have a lot of listeners in New York and LA and San Francisco, but I have a ton of listeners all over and in a lot of smaller cities as well. And I think everybody would like to say, this sounds great. This sounds like an opportunity. Here's a person who has kind of mapped out something that maybe could look like what my life could look like. How long did it take you to get to the point where you felt like you had your community kind of clocked? And how much did you have to be like super marketing guy in order to pull that off?
Well, I think for the studio, I mean, I've literally been building the studio for probably 25 years. So, and as far as marketing, the thing that I've done is just to try to do the best work possible. I really haven't advertised. It's really just been networking and referrals that have powered that thing. Although with the idea of moving the studio, I definitely want to put a new push on just upgrading the message a bit.
Right.
But yeah, I think with the studio, it's just been grinding it out, and there's obviously no security, because
Right.
you could hit a slow month. I mean, January was pretty slow.
Yeah.
February is going well. This end of December is always a little slow. So you have to, you just have to keep pushing and sometimes work on projects that you don't love.
Sure.
But in that way, always try to find something about the project that can feed you. You know what I mean? Even if it's just finding an awesome new way to clean up breaths or
Right.
or
Right.
line up doubles or something like that.
Well, so,
But I didn't. So what you were saying about your question about being in a small town,
yeah.
um, I think it's awesome. I think there's sometimes the frustration of certain projects that don't reach outside of the city, and the desire to sort of have your works seen by more people. So when they do, like the house music stuff that I was doing, it was a group called Three Generations Walking.
Okay.
That stuff had like a really great worldwide profile to it, and it was kind of very much known in the deep house scene in New York, like at Body and Soul and parties like that. So kind of when you have a taste of that, there's sort of this, bratty entitlement where you're sort of like, yeah, that's awesome. I want my work to be known around the world. And then sometimes you're working on projects that are not known around the world, and there's like a bit of a frustration or a longing. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah, I get that. Now, the other thing, way back when dinosaurs still roamed the earth, I was a co-owner of a recording studio in Texas, and it was in a small town near Dallas. We did a lot of work with sort of like the Texas punk scene. It was pretty awesome.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but one of the things I noticed is that there was a tendency among people to say, this is all good and fine. I'm glad I can do this work here, but the second that I get more money or I get some sort of a deal or whatever, I'm going to go to the big city to do my work. Do you run into that a lot?
For me personally, or for people that I'm working with?
For people that you're working with.
Yeah, I mean, I do so much work in the rap field.
Yeah.
So a lot of that is, aspirational kinds of songs about making it and rolling high and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
And it's just funny to a certain extent over the years, you just get numb to that because you hear the same, sort of desires in terms of wealth.
Right.
And then you see a lot of those people go nowhere anyway.
Yeah.
And a lot of people will sometimes jokingly say, when I make it, I'm gonna bring you with me. And I always say, yeah, sure. I mean, we have a kid that's actually from Pittsburgh named Mike Metlay, who is a former client of mine, and he was a high school student when he worked with me for about 2.5, 3 years.
Okay.
And he is now huge. So he's like really in that way, like in terms of the hip hop game, he's like the one that rose to the highest heights. And of course, he's living in LA now and doesn't do much work in the city at all.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Right.
But I'm not mad at that. I mean, I understand. You know what I mean? It makes more sense to be where he is.
Oh yeah. Well, and I think a lot of times in those kind of environments too, you end up regardless of using the phrase "getting signed" used to mean a very specific thing. Now it means a very specific other thing, right?
Yeah.
And now when you get signed, it's sort of like there's this whole package of producers and featured artists and collaborators and stuff like that just come with the package. And I don't think that you even have a choice much anymore of where you're going to work.
Yeah, I mean, the business has changed so much. I mean, and there is more of this notion of kind of rolling your own career where you can be independent. You could sell some products off the grid or to your own people or sell direct. And I don't know. So much of that business is such a turnoff and so much, can I curse?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's just so much bullshit and so much, hot air.
Right.
That I think the thing is like what I've really found, like especially with a lot of the young people that I work with, is I try to tell them like, look, I mean, part of it is the idea of it's not a notion of like all or nothing. It's a notion of kind of the way my trajectory has gone of just being like a worker in the field and sort of forming some type of a means by more of the trade.
Right, sure.
And not so much about because I mean, I've had my brushes with fame. I mean, we had a reggae band for years, and there was a point at which we had a major Jamaican producer that was looking to sign my brother and I, and it's like you go through these things where there's like this, suddenly there's this great thing that you're just on the cusp of, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And what I've been saying to a lot of these young guys, I work with a lot of young rappers, and I've kind of tried to say like you have to sort of think of it as more of a way that you can make a way as a worker, as a technician. It's not like either you're like playing in bars or you're a billionaire.
Right.
There's got to be
in-between
more
stuff.
Yeah, there's got to be some middle ground. I mean, it's like, I heard this interview with Little Steven from Bruce Springsteen's band, and they were like, did you ever think that you guys were going to be, that you were going to make it like this? He was like, hell no. I mean, there were so many middle band groups that were just doing the same thing, So for one of them to become like a stadium rocker and the rest of them to fade into obscurity, I mean, everybody can't be Michael Jackson.
Interesting. So you have been, you said that you've been working on building your studio for 25 years. I've got that makes me want to ask like 50 questions right there. But the first one is, to what extent is doing something like running a studio just sort of a marathon, just by its very nature? That you have to be prepared for the long haul if you're going to be successful.
No, I agree. I mean, in my town, it's really just having enough repetition of your name being out there for people to know that that's a place to go. It's been in my home all this time. Since '98, it's been in my home. You know, you have to sort of, I guess, convince people to an extent this is a real studio. And it is a real studio. In terms of the marathon of just like over the years, you mean?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even feel that it's a hardship, because in a way, it's pretty awesome to be paid to,
it's paid, it's paid to play with tape recorders.
Yeah, I mean, occasionally, you know, I don't always. The thing is, I've cultivated a really cool group of clients. You know, not every client is working on projects that I feel are inspiring and awesome, but I feel that what's starting to happen more is I'm starting to connect with more and more young people that are weirder. There's been a turn in the hip hop world to get back to weird a little bit, you know, where it's kind of gone away from it. You know, it used to be that there was more space for like odd, you know, sort of twisted kind of approaches.
Right.
And then for a long time recently, it's just gotten super straight. And even though people look at it like a kind of all like this sort of thuggish, rough around the edges type of nature of things, I feel that even in that it's becoming regimented.
Right.
You know, and the music is becoming, and the lyrics are becoming more and more basic and less interesting.
Well, what I've certainly noticed is that in a lot of what's at least, you know, the popular rap world, it's becoming as formulaic as R&B, I would say.
Exactly. No, exactly.
And which, you know, if I think back to some of the, you know, the formation of it, it's hard to even imagine it would have gone that way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I never thought working in hip hop in the early days that when I was listening to the first LL Cool J record or Beastie Boys, I didn't think of it as pop music.
No, not even close.
But it's definitely become this crazy dominant musical force, you know.
So when you say that you're starting to see it kind of take a move towards the weird, or, you know, maybe a different way to say it would be experimental, what does that look like? Does it look like people, you know, extending like the old Wu-Tang kind of experimentalism, or is it people embracing other kinds of music and pulling that in? What does it look like to you?
Well, I think part of it is breaking out of some of the types of production styles and getting into things that are, you know, sort of reintroducing dissonance. Right. And also breaking, you know, 16-bar verse, 8-bar hook form. And also, I think the most important thing is breaking subject matter apart and not just making songs about sex and
money. Right.
Sex and money and you know, and like you know, beef between crews and all this kind of stuff. Like, it just gets to be so tiresome, and it's crazy because like I've just engineered so much of the foulest shit that you've ever heard. Like, you know, really just terrible subject matter, and you know, I'll take it as, you know, for the skill and the trade and do whatever I got to do to make it sound the way the artist wants it to sound. You know what I mean?
Right.
But I think, like, I have a new kid that I've been mentoring that's calling himself Montel Fish, and he's just like a weird, beautiful kid. He's 17 years old. He plays his own music, so he creates his own tracks, and he's singing more, and he raps about things that are more. He's exposing more of himself and being more. What's the word? He's just kind of putting out like different sides of himself, talking about where he might feel, you know, unguarded about certain things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's kind of a gutsy move.
I love it.
I think in a way, you know, screaming about grabbing a stack of cash or something is got to be easy. You have, from your seat especially, it's got to seem like, oh, that's the easy way out.
Well, it's also just one of those things where you hear it 1,000 times and you're like, Jesus, man, like, come on.
Yeah, okay.
Like, just try to talk about, you know, and I think the thing is I've been really thinking about like a lot of these groups like this guy Childish Gambino, who's the actor Donald Glover,
Okay.
or there's a guy named Earl Sweatshirt, and this crew kind of Odd Future. Like a lot of these guys are just breaking out of the bonds of convention in a way that's really interesting and inspiring. Or I don't know if you've ever heard of Death Grips. They're not. They just disbanded, but their stuff's noisy and it's loud. It's very punk sounding,
All right. Well,
And
I have to look that up because I haven't heard of them, but it sounds interesting.
Oh, Death Grips is it's like Death Grips sounds like Einstürzchen Neubauten or something with like screamy raps on top.
Interesting. Well, it's interesting that you characterized it as punky because I think sometimes, I mean, at least to me, there are a lot of parallels between what to me was a movement that I got off on, which is the punk movement, and the rawness of rap, especially to me. Again, I'm kind of I don't want to embrace old guy radio here, but maybe the way I saw rap happening when it was first coming down, it had all that same like anger and rage and almost anti-establishment to the core.
Yeah, and also I think the means of production was easier because you think about the earliest tracks that are like drum machine and vocals, you know what I mean? And you don't need a big studio to record drum kit.
And in a lot of cases, distributed on cassette to the neighbors.
Yeah, so I'm like, I'm a big fan of any kind of music that is produced, like, old school Jamaican dance hall,
right,
or, early hip hop or old school house music. Like I don't feel that we should be always, extolling the virtues of these temples of sound that are. I love fancy studios, you know what I mean? I love high end gear, but I don't want a kid to ever feel like they can't make their shit because they can't afford, a really nice mic or whatever. They should just use whatever is at hand, and that's why the 4-track cassette is such a revelation. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I have to admit that you say that you like the high end studios. I'm almost irritated by them. I hate to say it that way, but for me, when I was coming up through the thing, I had trouble embracing the crusty studio that I had, or the crusty production technique I was able to pull off with limited amount of gear, because every month the freaking Mix magazine would show up with the newest $10 million plush studio. And I was like, well, I'll never be able to compete with that. Where that was just like as wrong-headed as possible. But that got to be sort of like what the Watchtower is for Jehovah's Witnesses, I guess. Mix magazine was for recording people, which was to kind of hook you into doing it this way, like it's always, like we've been told it should always have been done.
That's why I love tape. I love tape op though.
Yeah, I was going to say I wish that tape op would have existed back then, because then I would have said, oh, you know what? A 4-track in the chicken coop is an absolutely cool studio.
Yeah, no, I totally support that, and I, some of the greatest stuff ever was produced with just the most humble means, and I think fidelity is fidelity is important. I mean, I have my share of snobby audio gear. I use a U87 mic generally, and I have a Neve clone pre, and I have an API pre, and I love the way that stuff sounds. You know what I mean? I wanted to talk about distortion. You know what I mean? Just the notion of distortion, because Jonathan Stern, he wrote Audible Past.
Oh, this is not ringing a bell to me, no.
He wrote that book, and he wrote a book called The MP3, A Meaning of a Format.
Yes, that I read. I read that when I was getting my master's degree, right?
So I went to a thing that he was speaking about, speaking at CMU actually, and we were talking in a talkback section, and I asked about MP3s, because we had been talking about MP3s, and I was saying about how it was such a scourge and such a curse to my work, and how people are always bringing me these instrumentals. And what he said that I thought was so interesting is he said that every generation has its distortions, or has its distortion. And if you think back to vinyl records or cassettes or guitar amplifiers or whatever, there's always some way that people are roughing up sound.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Whether it be intentionally or accidentally, but we shouldn't dismiss like the creations just because we find that form of distortion maybe unpleasant at first. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny too. I mean, At one point, I had actually sketched out I didn't know what I was going to do with it, if I was going to try and have it published or whatever, but the title of this article that I wrote was Walter Sear's a fucking idiot, right? Because I would read everything about him and it's like, well, without the tube, we don't even have music. And without a recording industry, the way it's always existed, we don't even have music. And these kids today, whenever you hear that phrase, these kids today, you just want to grit your teeth and just, and he'd be like, they don't even know how to make good sounding music. And I was like, if you really think about it, practically every interesting recording technique from the last 30 years has really come out of people who are using crap gear that found an interesting use for it. Production and recording techniques have come out of poverty and necessity far more often than they've come out of excess.
No, I agree. I mean, this engineer friend of mine, he works with this dude, Earl Sweatshirt, and he was saying this kid is a total, he's just a very creative, unique guy. He said that the guy put a Apple pitch shifter plug-in, the AU pitch,
right.
that he puts it on the master bus and just pitches the whole damn thing down. And he's
just
like, he's just like, I don't give a fuck, man. I love the way it sounds, and I know that it's wrong. And the guy is just saying that he's working with all these kids, and it's the same way with me. Like, I try to show some best practices and say, look, I mean, we can get more definition out of the bass if we sidechain this way, or if we cut here and we don't like stack up our frequencies in the low end.
Right.
But sometimes, wrong. Yeah, like you said, I love hearing new abuses, and I feel like as an older guy in the music industry, I'm inspired all the time by kids coming up with, I don't want to see what they do when they go into a palace.
Right.
Like I want to see what they do when they're just by themselves and nobody's telling them that it's wrong. I mean, on the other hand, like, I do get recordings from people for me to mix, and I am horrified sometimes. And I do feel that there's nothing wrong with showing what some better practices are. Like, certainly telling them, like, hey, let me just show you how to kind of like create a quiet area in your space where you can put a mic. Mm-hmm. Where you can like isolate it from outside traffic sounds, or turn off the air conditioner, or turn down your monitors. Like, shit like that, I think is not being overly snobby.
Yeah. Well, do you ever find that people who come in with really rough tracks like that too assume that because you're a engineer that you can just like turn the magic knob and make everything sound great?
Well, I mean, yeah. And yeah, I've definitely heard that a bunch of times. Like, well, can't you just fix that? But my thing to them is that the thing is, like, I just feel like as a sound engineer part, I want to tell people, like, sure, I can definitely work on this, and I can go through and I can remove all the, noise between your ad lib tracks and all this stuff, but you have to pay me for the time.
Right.
So I might be able to spend 2 hours cleaning this track up, and I do support, on the other hand, like, if what they need to do is to hang out with a bunch of their boys and get wasted and just get in the zone and create this like crazy ass thing, I'd rather they do that in their own space than come to me. You know what I mean?
Right.
But they have to understand, like, I have to charge you.
Yeah.
To like get all this crap out of here, and it's going to sound better. I think that a leaky mic with like monitors feeding back into it is not really what you're necessarily going for. But maybe something about, the guy like screaming into the mic and just distorting everything is cool.
Well, this is a thing that I actually really learned when I was working with the punks down in Denton, Texas, is how often I needed to just get the hell out of the way, because it turns out that trying to make a great recording and providing the vibe that it took for someone to really let it loose was two completely different things.
No, I agree. And I think especially vocal performances.
Yeah, especially, right.
Yeah, I've definitely had people in the booth like spilling their soul, and it's like, I'm not going to get in the way and just be like, I want to avoid certain things, like if a preamp is clipping or whatever, I'd like to sort of make that not happen, because I do feel like getting back to the thing about distortion is like, distortion's awesome. I think it's just sort of knowing where and when to do it.
Sure.
Because I've recently been doing some mixes for people and reintroducing digital clipping to certain things on a secondary bus
Yeah.
with kicks and snares and using that Plogue bit crusher plugin
Right.
to kind of but just so that it's not on everything. You know what I
Sure.
mean?
Of course. Again, it's interesting to me to see that, side chaining, which for a long time was just sort of like the thing engineers did and nobody talked about, all of a sudden now is a real creative practice. And I think that, some of this use of like secondary buses with effects, you're starting to hear about that come on more and more as people want to be able to control these sort of heavy and across the mix kind of functions. So it's kind of cool to literally see sort of the recording practice change before your eyes,
Right. Well, I think the thing is like coming from being a person that made records on tape machines and consoles is I don't yearn for the good old days. I feel like as a person that's done all of that stuff and spliced tape and edited half-inch masters and all that stuff. Like I'm glad I had the chance to do all that stuff, but I feel that you can always find a way to rough it up,
right,
in an interesting way, and having the flexibility to do it however you want. I'm not a fan of like complaining about the fact that I have too many options.
right.
I think you can impose options and keep your track count down and all of that within a DAW. And I think the fact is we're lucky. And as an older person that has had the chance to do it with hardware, I love Ableton Live. I think it is like the coolest thing in the world. And I've told people I feel it's like the culmination of like everything I've ever done, every piece of gear I've ever worked with, every sampler I've ever used. With the flexibility of being able to do just about anything.
Yeah, and do it in real time. I agree with you. I mean, it's a funny story, but at one point, I went into town. We wanted to buy, of all things, it didn't last long around the house, but this thing called the Love Sack, right? Which is basically a 6-foot around beanbag chair. Okay. And they sell these at Love Sack stores inexplicably. So we go into the Love Sack store, and the sales dude, who was, about the age of my shoes, was talking to me about how, asking me like what I did. And I was like, well, I'm in the audio industry. And he's like, oh, do you know of Tape Op? I'm like, yeah, I know Tape Op. It's a really cool magazine. He's like, yeah, that describes my perfect life. I'm like, really? So, like, what are the things that you're really into? He's like, tape decks. I just want to do tape decks. And he's like, have you ever worked with tape decks? And I was like, dude, if I could have all the rewind time that I've ever experienced in my life, if I could have all of that back, I would be about your age. Right?
Yeah.
And so there are parts of that stuff that nobody really recognizes as being a pain, right?
Yeah.
Like crosstalk. Who even thinks about crosstalk at this point,
Yeah, and it's like trying to reclaim some of that by using these new, bus summing.
Right, and little leakage plugins. Go figure that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing is like we've come. I mean, I know a lot of people say this, but it's like we've come full circle because if you think about, like, I remember I was telling somebody about when I was living out in Oregon, and there was a Nile Rodgers record that came out called something Plan B or something like that, and Plan B Matinee or something like that, and it was one of those early records that was done either on a Fairlight or a synclavier,
right?
And everybody was flipping out like, this is the future, this is incredible. Listen, there's no background noise, there's no tape hiss, there's no nothing, and there's also no character in that record. I mean, it's just squeaky clean. It's like all samples, all internal, very kind of harsh. Nile Rodgers is incredible.
Yeah.
But it's like those early records are pretty damn dry.
Right. Yeah, I remember the first album I got that I was like really screaming about it, being digitally recorded was Ry Cooder.
Oh, Ry Cooder.
It was a Ry Cooder album, and I always loved his music, but it was really weird to hear this like real old school music with this real plastic edge to it. Because, they were just getting their shit together with digital, analog to digital converters and all, and editing functions and all that stuff. So it was kind of a tad horrific, I think, trying to do it. And then to have that music be at the forefront was really weird.
Yeah, I mean, and even just think about the thing that changed everything for people like me was, I went from a half-inch 8-track machine syncing to Digital Performer or syncing Digital Performer with SMPTE to ADAT. Yeah, and it was like at that time it was like choosing between ADAT and DA88.
Right.
Like that stuff sounds pretty terrible, but it's also once again like the thing that it put into our hands, like the capability of doing all this stuff.
Oh yeah, well, because people I think now have trouble even imagining an 8-track limit. Or the fact is, back then, for many of us, it was a 6-track limit because you always had to keep 2 tracks for the inevitable bounce down to stereo. Right. So that you could do more sweetening over the top or whatever. And so when all of a sudden the ADAT showed up, and it was like, oh my God, you mean I have virtually no sound loss when I dump it to 2 channels? It was pretty incredible.
Yeah, no, it's cool, but it's just, I think things are better now.
Oh yeah, I do too. Well, and again, I think what'll be interesting to me is to sort of like cast 15 years from now and say, what are we going to look back to today and say, oh, those poor saps with that cheesy shit, right? Yeah. Is it going to be the pitch shifting that we do, or is it going to, what's it going to be? I'm wondering.
It'll probably be autocorrect tuning. Yeah. And the thing is, like, I'm not even mad about that. Like, I think a lot of those abuses are hilarious and interesting. And, there's some hip hop artists that are doing some really crazy stuff with that type of technology. Right. And, I think there's nothing wrong with playing around with it. You could always look back on, I don't know, like a lot of the records I've done, listening back to certain things, a lot of things I listened back to and I feel like it still holds up. And then I think the things that were really too much on the nose with like some new trend, that's right. Usually the thing that makes
what
me
suffers. Yeah,
that makes me wince when I'm just like,
yeah. And at the time, you thought that was the one that nailed it.
Yeah. I just listened to an old record that I was so inspired by Massive Attack and and Portishead. And it was like,
oh, me too. Massive Attack was, to me, I heard that and I was like, oh, slowing that shit down is so right.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Sure.
So you are obviously doing a lot of music yourself, as in addition to the sound design and stuff. First of all, when you're working with artists, whether it's rap artists or whatever, do you kind of put yourself out there as also being able to do some of the performance or some of the instrumental work, or do you try and completely separate your recording and engineering life from your creative performance life?
Well, lately I've been putting more into like the people that I'm sort of more connected with in a mentorship type of a position.
Right.
But I don't tend in the hip hop world to really make tracks, and I usually tell people, look, the stuff that I want to do is probably too weird for you.
Right.
And I don't want to take something that I really love and have somebody do something that I'm just not that crazy about artistically. Yeah. Sure. But in general, for a lot of like just the session kind of work, people tend to bring in the music that they want to use, because most of the times people tend to be inspired by the music already that they want to use.
Right.
So like, worst case scenario is people just bringing in a 2-track beat, and I'll just suck it up and live with it. You know what I mean? Even if I don't, and I'll usually complain and just say, look, this beat sounds really bad. And most of the times people will just look at me like I'm crazy. But this one client is calling me, he calls me bat ears now. He's like, dude, I don't hear what you're hearing. And it's a really great guy that I'm working with. This dude, Jaziri X, he's a really awesome, pretty militant in places, MC who's originally from Chicago, but he lives here.
Okay. And
he runs a program with his wife called One Hood, which is awesome youth programming that teaches kids about, lyric writing, but also about social justice issues and So that's been incredible. But so there's that, and then the best thing is that they bring in instrumentals that they're connected with the producer, so that the producer or producers are going to provide stems, or they're going to
Right.
provide individual tracks. So I just mixed a guy's record that I really am digging. I just finished the mastering for that last night and ran him all the files. And so that gives me the chance to, to like stretch out and even just correct for things and tighten up the low end and,
Sure.
really optimize it. And, I want this stuff to bang. I want it to be able to compete and to be able to like live in the arena of its counterparts. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, and then in some cases, if somebody brings in a beat, I may enhance it for them. When I'm doing sessions more in live, like normally I work in performer,
Mm-hmm.
but if I see that maybe a beat needs some help, I might sort of treat the mid range and high end of it as a sample, and then build around it with
Oh,
with
sure.
drum rack
Right.
and stuff like that. So I've been doing more of that lately, and that lets me get a little bit of my creative juices going for those types of tracks.
Kind of wedged into that work, right?
Yeah, just because sometimes I just feel like there's been this sort of plague of beats from places like SoundClick, and which is like a sort of a horrible kind of middle of the road place where people go and get beats that are more like sound alike kind of tracks.
Mm-hmm.
So people will be like, I want a beat that sounds like Rick Ross, or I want a beat that
Right.
sounds like this or that, and or Wiz Khalifa, who's also from Pittsburgh. So you'll have all these clone beats that people will pick, but the producers don't make them with an ear for like what's going to happen next.
Well, that's really curious to me. So you're saying that it's almost like sound library work, but as backing tracks for rappers rather than backing tracks for a TV show.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Wow.
And you'll hear just like things that are just literal knockoffs. It's really discouraging, and I always just try to say to people, like, please try to find some kindred spirits that will like follow through on this project with you, and let's try to upgrade, and it's also a budget thing, you know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
not everybody
Yeah.
can. Sometimes people want to just bang out a track and have it done in an hour, and that's fine,
I guess, but on the flip side of it is, I was actually, it was a while back, but I was really encouraged by this one magazine called Scratch Magazine. I don't know if you remembered it.
I don't know that.
Yeah, it was literally a magazine that was oriented towards beat makers rather than the rap star.
Right,
And it was really cool because they talk to people not about, what was it like when you were in the VIP room with so and so, but more like what was it like when you were in your bedroom with your MPC 1000
right,
cracking off this beat. And it was
right,
really interesting because they sort of like took what to me was some really, really creative work and highlighted it. And
right.
unfortunately, after about 50 episodes of the magazine, they were done, right? But it
Sure.
was really super inspiring up to that point. And for me, I always looked at that as being like one of those super creative and super kind of growth areas for people that were into doing production and music creation, but not necessarily into the star lifestyle.
Right, and that's the thing, and what I was going to come back to, and I wanted to talk briefly about this apprenticeship program that I'm developing, is that I always found that even within like most groups, if you had a couple people that were involved in some kind of like, especially a rap thing, there was always that person. There was always one person, one kid that was much more oriented towards the production end of things.
Right.
Maybe they were the beat maker, and those are the people that I always feel a lot of kinship to, because I always feel like they are the ones that are the crafts person and the artist, and I'm not gonna say that other people aren't artists, but they're the people that are getting into the nuts and bolts and the work, and are more interested in the technique, and are more like watching me to see what it is that I'm doing.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I feel like there is so much craft and so much tradition, even though it sounds funny, like if you're thinking about the earliest sampling drum machines, EMU SP1200s, and, early Ensonics and stuff like that. Like I worked with a lot of people that used ASR 10s. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? And it's kind of like the beat makers, I almost just kind of feel like it's sort of, I'm not going to say it's disparaging, but it's sort of like kind of understating what it is that people are actually doing.
You mean by calling it beat making?
Yeah, I mean, I like beat making, but I also feel like those are the people that are the producers. You know,
Right.
they're doing more than just making a track.
Oh, yeah. To me, what they were doing was sort of like creating the game board that the game got played in. And sure, you might play chess or checkers on top of it, but without the game board, you got nothing.
I think that there is a lack of some of the tradition and connection now because of the way that people are getting instrumentals for songs. You know, like you listen to interviews with like, Bomb Squad people that were working with Public Enemy, like Hank Shockley, and like they really saw their role as being much more a part of the group and being involved in the productions from beginning to end. So they would do everything from creating the tracks, starting to build them, to being involved in the composition and the mixing of things. And I feel like there is a weird disconnect now with kids that are making tracks, and then they're just like, okay, this is done. And a lot of times I'll bitch about it, and I'll just be like, look, this dude has this sample, like the mid-range instrumental sample, the keyboard sound or whatever, way too loud for this song because it's like, I don't know whether this guy's going to be whispering on the track, whether he's going to be yelling, whether he's going to be singing, whether it's going to be a poem. Like all those decisions, the instrumental part of the song has to be in service of this new thing.
Right.
So why the hell are we just like rapping on top of this thing now?
Yeah, that's a great point.
And that's why I get so excited when I can, like, people think I'm being like such a nerd, but I'm just like, dude, please give me the parts to this song. Like, I won't take that long. Like, if I could just have the chance to turn it down.
Tweak it a little bit, right?
Yeah, and then when I do, people are just like, holy shit, that sounds so much better.
Right.
But it's
bat ears.
Yeah.
So now you have to like add on to it. So your Facebook thing has to be Herman Soy Sauce Bat Ears Pearl. You have to start like tacking all these things on.
People think I have these crazy big ears or something.
They'll see you. It's like, my goodness, your ears are regular sized.
I don't know why they call you bat ears.
So I'm curious about the apprenticeship program that you talked about, and I teach at a local university, so I get some of my teaching yayas out that way. But I've never done a one-on-one apprenticeship because I'm kind of scared of like being the old guy waving. I don't want to be Walter Sear, Right. I want to be something else. And how do you handle that? How are you able to apprentice people without getting in their way and without having them say, oh yeah, the old coot just showed me how to properly wind a mic cable or something, right?
Right. Well, this is a thing that we're just getting going, and I have this great assistant that works with me, this kid Amos, who is he's studying music education. He's going for his master's, so he understands about dealing with the metrics of this thing.
Right.
But I think the thing it's like that just seems really great right now is that it's been this very organic process of working with young people over the course of the years and just developing this rapport. So I think on one hand, like these guys, this program is just getting ready to roll out pretty soon, and we kind of have it's not a formalized thing yet, but we've been in discussion with some of the local foundations, and I'm really excited. I feel like this is the path for the next number of years. Like it makes sense. I think part of it is that, first of all, you're working with people that want to be there, right. and I think that I've been able to demonstrate through working with them that I am that old guy, and they're all young enough to be my kids, but they respect the fact that I love the music and that I'm showing them respect, and I also am interested in their ideas. So it's not like I'm saying to them like distortion is bad or don't put too much reverb on your voice or something like that. But I wanna show them, the idea is to develop a set of fundamentals. So to teach about gain staging, to teach about saturation and EQ, modulation, spatial effects, reverbs, delays, teaching about EQs and the different kinds of EQs. And I think the thing is that the people that want to be there are psyched about that. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's really even just for the first time, like showing somebody how a high pass filter on a vocal or on a kick drum, why you'd want to do that. And, when I'm talking to somebody about watching and managing the low end of a song, it's not because I'm a stuck-up dick. It's because I want the shit to be hot. I want it to bang. I want it to compete and be able to play alongside other songs in its zone. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's kind of like, look, dude, this this track is not going to do what it is that you think you want it to do if we don't address some of these kinds of things. So, teaching about compression, it's huge. You know what I mean? And I think when people get their hands on the tools and they start to really see, there's like excitement there. You know what I mean? There's like there's a thrill, like just to be like, well, why are we putting compressors on these things? Because it makes the vocal be able to be loud and clear and manage the dynamics of it and be able to sit in a track that is aggressive.
Yep. We have blown through a ton of time here, and we haven't even talked very much about synthesizers and modulars and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Maybe we'll save that for a future discussion, but just really quick.
Sure.
Because all the Muff Wiggler people are going to be like, what the hell's going on?
Right.
So we have to honor those people.
Sure.
You are generally the way I would characterize it is that you're kind of a mouthpiece for Pittsburgh Modulars on the Muff Wiggler's site. What is your relationship with them, and how into the modular game are you?
Sure. Well, so I've basically known Richard Nichols since before he started the company. He used to be a .com guy, so he had this big .com system, and I was already using a Eurorack system, which I started building around 2006. Mm-hmm. So before that, I still do have an ARP 2600, so I wanted to kind of add to that.
Right.
So he started building his first modules literally in his basement, and then subsequently moved his manufacturing assembly space to the building where we have our dance studio.
Got it.
I've sort of just kind of organically morphed into a, you said, mouthpiece, brand ambassador, artist relations. Like, I've been dealing with local people that have contacted us about learning about the systems or, getting support and information about things. So I'll try to fill in there. I'm at the shop all the time because it's so close, and it's also where we have our space.
Oh, sure. Okay.
So I'll hang out and we'll talk about interface design and panel ergonomics, and I'll beta test everything that we make and give it a roll, give it a spin in the field. I went to NAMM with them for the last, the recent NAMM
right.
In Anaheim, and spent, a week, just talking about the products and giving demos to people and stuff like that. So, and like I said, I keep an eye on the Muff forum for when people are having problems, and try to like redirect when necessary to get people to write the company if they're having a problem with something like that. Was
that your first NAMM, by the way?
It was, yeah. It was crazy.
Yeah.
And I saw Mike Metlay there a few times. We had a chance to hang out, so that was awesome.
Yeah.
But that was his 19th.
Yeah, it's funny. Well, so what was your takeaway from NAMM? What did you like being there, or was it too overwhelming?
No, I did. I liked it. I love big crowds, and I mean, it was definitely like you have to learn to pace yourself and drink lots of water, and we all caught some sort of snotty, respiratory thing on the way in, so I was keeping that managed.
Right.
But it was like learning about like what end users were using and what people's experiences was. I spent a lot of time talking with people about what DAWs they use and how to interface the systems into their workflow. Mm-hmm. And so that was like a lot of really good information, and just seeing what other people had. I really came away pretty psyched about just the response that people had to the systems, because even with the smallest system, the System 10, the 10.1, it sounds great. Like, it really sounds great. It's a legit, real synthesizer.
Yeah, indeed.
It sounds fantastic, and I think that people really are connecting with Pittsburgh stuff, and it's accessible. You know what I mean? It has enough weirdness to it, and it also has enough of a familiar side that I think a lot of people will see it as a good option, and the price is good. It's placed in a accessible world. You know what I mean?
Yeah, indeed, Absolutely. Well, one of the things I have to admit is that I really think it's cool that when you're talking about them, you talk about it as a we, which is really cool because it's like you're informally attached to what they're doing, but also there is a sense, I mean, in a lot of cases when I talk about modular manufacturers and stuff, I even refer to them as being part of a we thing because there is a sense of community around this whole modular thing that I think is really cool.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I mean, I actually did have to get myself to say we because I'm not like a formal employee, but I'm a friend of the company's and I'm there all the time.
Right.
And I do, and especially I think that last NAMM run definitely made me feel like part of the team. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I feel like my role is valuable, and I've helped to sort of find things where there were snags in a panel or something like that, or just even just figuring out like where to put knobs, where to put switches,
Sure.
how to sort of redirect something or add a feature or take away a feature, So it's nice because they sort of see me as someone that uses this stuff all the time and knows how to use it and knows it has an idea of like what people would want or what they wouldn't want.
Right. Herman, I want to thank you for your time. But before we go, on your Facebook posting, you mentioned something about soon you're going to be heading off to Turkey. What's up with that?
So I have a big birthday coming up, and my wife and I are going to go for 2 weeks, mainly to Istanbul. And I have this beautiful fantasy of interfacing with all these artists in Turkey and sort of having the kind of beautiful time that I would give somebody that was visiting from Turkey. You know what I mean?
Right, sure.
So we've been getting all these great referrals and people that have worked in Turkey, people that are teaching in Turkey, and I'm just thrilled, man. I could really use this.
Well, that sounds really exciting. Boy, I would love to do something like that myself. I have to get my kids out of elementary school, I think, before I'm going to be able to pull that one off.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
Still, that sounds pretty awesome. So anyone out there who has contacts in Istanbul, send them on in, or if you can get to Herman directly, shoot him the info because I think people would find it really interesting. So, Herman, I want to thank you so much for your time. It was really inspiring to me to kind of see a person who's weaving this really cool life together. Thank you so much for sharing, and have a great day, man.
Yeah, thanks, Darwin.
All right. Okay, many thanks to Herman for that great interview. It was really cool to kind of hear about the recording studio and current recording practice from a guy whose feet are on the ground. It's also really cool to sort of get to know the man behind the Soy Sauce name a little bit. It was really pretty awesome to talk to him. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I do. Thanks everyone for listening. Please, if you get a chance, jump over to iTunes and give me a positive review if you can. Otherwise, just keep on listening. We're getting great listenership numbers, which makes me feel like the word's getting spread. That's really awesome. I want to thank everyone for their help, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.